Your kindness is leaking through the cracks you refuse to inspect. Welcome to UpGoWise. Let's dive right into this explainer of the book, The War for Kindness. The War for Kindness by Jamil Zaki. You see, this book builds its entire premise around a pretty cold claim. It doesn't flatter your softness. Instead, it asks a hard question. Does care actually have a structure? It's not just a mood, it's not a pose, and it's definitely not a warm room with weak beams. You know the room, right? Someone needs you, and you answer well at first. You hold the door open, you listen, you make space. But then, the weight just keeps coming. You can almost feel the walls starting to hum under the pressure. You're smiling with your face, sure, but you're withdrawing with your hands. You still know all the right words to say, but honestly, they start to sound like rented plaster slapped over a crack. That private split, it's exhausting. It makes your kindness feel fake. It makes your patience feel rented, and it makes silence feel so much safer than actual contact. Here is the reality slap we have to face. You probably call it compassion fatigue, but the actual mechanism at play here is load-bearing empathy with absolutely zero design margin. I want you to picture a small brass hinge. It's just hardware, right? It's not fate, yet the entire door turns right there on that tiny piece of metal. A good hinge makes movement possible, but a bad hinge makes every single opening feel like you're causing damage. This is the first real cut. Maybe you didn't lose your kindness. Maybe, just maybe, you built your kindness on a joint that was never, ever meant to hold that much load. Jamil Zaki completely challenges the stories we tell ourselves. In this book, he states, empathy is less like a fixed trait and more like a skill. When we fail, the shame usually hits first. Then comes the coldness. Then we tell ourselves the story that we're just less caring now. But this book breaks that wall down. The old myth says empathy arrives as a fully finished room. You either get it or you don't. But a fixed trait gives you zero tools to work with. A trained structure, on the other hand, gives you inspection points. It gives you screws to tighten. It gives you places to actually stop lying to yourself. Let's look at the first face of this exhaustion, which is overcarrying. Your internal expert voice probably says, I cannot afford empathy when I am this tired. And hey, that sounds totally sane, doesn't it? It feels like a healthy boundary. But watch how that logic just eats itself. When empathy is treated as extra weight, you wait until there's a crisis to actually use it. And then every single person who walks in arrives as a massive load. You don't inspect, you just brace for impact. You don't ask, you simply absorb. This refusal was meant to save your energy, but it actually makes every single contact feel infinitely heavier. You start measuring people by their pressure. Who's going to need too much? Who's going to demand a room you literally cannot afford to give them? But honestly, that's not perception. That is just a building under severe strain. Look at the terrible options we usually give ourselves. You can carry everyone and watch the ceiling bow under the unsupported load, or you can become cold and the room completely empties out. Choose one. The problem is, both of these options punish the builder. This book diagnoses that false beam perfectly. We are using empathy as an endurance test instead of training it as perception. Untrained empathy really isn't noble. It's just random architecture. You end up overbuilding near the pain, underbuilding near distant pain, and you let guilt pick the room. That is exactly why exhaustion feels so moral, because the load isn't being distributed properly, it's just being dumped on you. I want you to pause for a second. Visualize a set of blueprints sitting on a desk, and you're drawing a heavy pencil line right across them. Where is that first hidden beam? Where does your kindness actually have absolutely no support? Where are you confusing speed with kindness, like thinking a really fast yes is actually a good yes? Where do you confuse distance with permission? And where exactly are you confusing guilt with structure? Sometimes the absolute strongest kindness is totally unseen. It's just a small pause before you get defensive. It's asking one clean question. It is the active choice to ask before you assign weight. Now let's move to a completely different wall in this house, and a completely different crack. The second face of this issue is defensive judgment. Your inner voice says, if I understand them, I will excuse them. Now, this belief sounds super principled. It feels like it protects the wall, but in reality, it completely consumes the room it's trying to protect. When understanding is treated as surrender, curiosity becomes unsafe. The door stays firmly shut. The air goes totally stale. The other person becomes nothing more than a threat. Sure, you keep your judgment, but you completely lose your perception. A sealed wall cannot learn. It can only repeat its own pressure. And this is where the war for kindness becomes wonderfully dangerous. Empathy is a doorway. It is not the removal of a wall. It doesn't ask you to approve of everything. It just asks you to enter with some structure. Empathy isn't taking a sledgehammer to the wall. It's carefully building a doorway in the exact right place. The wall is still standing. The threshold simply changes. You don't have to surrender your judgment. You just delay its final form. You give the room a doorway before you hand down a verdict. Let's go back to that hinge for a moment. Movement didn't destroy the door, right? Movement is what made the room usable in the first place. The hinge does not argue with the door. It just bears the turn. And the whole sound of the room changes when that door moves freely. That, right there, is the architecture of care. So, name one hinge you've been avoiding. Is it a hard question, a necessary boundary, a repair you need to make, or maybe just a 10-second pause? Think of the hardware. A hinge has screws, a plate, a pin, friction. Care has parts too: attention, choice, limit, repair. When just one of those parts fails, the whole door feels cursed. But this book tells us to stop and inspect the part. Don't just curse the entire house. Real repair begins exactly where blame becomes precise. When the cost becomes visible and your room loses all its warmth, we face a second dilemma. You can seal the room completely so no one can ever wound you again. Or you can open the room with zero structure and let every single sound and pressure enter until you collapse. Choose. Obviously, one option is total isolation, and the other is an inevitable collapse. But here's the thing. You aren't actually protecting your kindness. You're just protecting a really brittle design. In The War for Kindness, the diagnosis here is incredibly sharp. We constantly mistake our barricades for boundaries. We think we're building beams for sustained care, but we're really just refusing entry. This is a crucial distinction. A boundary says, this beam can hold exactly this much right here. A barricade just screams, nobody comes in. From a distance, they might look kind of similar, but they feel completely different when you're inside. One creates a safe space for care, the other just preserves your fear. A boundary has a load rating. It's built for everyday use. A barricade has a threat rating. It's built purely for panic. Empathy isn't less genuine just because it's practiced and structured. That practice is exactly what makes the room trustworthy. Let's return to that blueprint for a minute. Look closely at the structure you've been carrying all this time. What heavy load are you still calling a virtue? Let me tell you, overcarrying was never proof of your love. It was just a missing beam. Your kindness was leaking, not because you're empty or hollow inside, but simply because the joint was cracked. The old way of thinking just wanted a warmer mood, but this new model, it asks for a stronger joint. And that difference changes absolutely everything. The truth is, a kinder life is not a softer house. You didn't need to grow a larger heart. You needed a proper load path. Your judgment didn't need to die, it just needed a doorway. The philosophy we're talking about here is pretty severe. A self isn't kinder just because it feels more things. A self is kinder when it can actually hold contact without collapsing. This book gives you that harder, much better standard. Build care that can actually survive weight. Build boundaries that keep your room habitable. That is not softness. That is craftsmanship under pressure. And here at UpGoWise, we aren't asking for softness. UpGoWise is asking for craftsmanship. So here is the final verdict on the architecture of yourself. Kindness needs beams. A fractured world doesn't need any more decorative virtue. It needs rooms where care can actually bear stress. Rooms with working doors. Rooms with solid beams. Rooms with safe margins. Think of your very next conversation as a load test. Not to test their worth, but to test your structure. Ask a question before judging. Set a limit before you start resenting. Repair the joint before you rewrite yourself as a cold person. A true beam doesn't just perform strength, it actually holds. This is the decision. Make it right now. Because if not now, not ever. Access your growth map. Step 1. Within the next 24 hours, I want you to ask one clean question before judging one person. Step 2. Notice whether that single question made the room more habitable. And ask yourself, what else could you possibly build if your kindness was finally designed to survive the wait?